Okay, Chapter 6 is on the United States and Canada. In this realm, it consists of two nation states, the United States and Canada. Both are very highly developed regions and a very high level of energy usage. Of course, they also produce a lot of energy as well. In terms of the environment, it's a very large landmass and it's well suited to human adaptation. Climate patterns, obviously, in the north, extreme north, you have the Arctic. Then the southeast United States has a very wet, humid climate. Precipitation increases as you move south and east. The jet stream moving from west to east provides winter weather for most of the country and lake effect snows around the Great Lakes. Obviously, climate is undergoing a lot of change, and it has for centuries. And you'll notice at the bottom maps the differences in climate situations. Global climate change has been in existence for over 7 billion years and will probably continue to do so. The large carbon footprint that the textbook talks about really hasn't had any dramatic effect on the climate in the United States. There have been times where carbon has been much higher than it is presently, and we've had ice ages. So I don't think the carbon situation is really impacting weather or climate to any great extent. Landform maps, you'll notice the color codes for the different landforms from the Canadian Shield all the way to the river and lake systems. And then, of course, here in Nebraska, we're in the Great Plains. Due to the various landforms and the fact that we have kind of a collision of different continental plates, we have some natural hazards, earthquakes, landslides. In the western U.S., we have a tendency for droughts and wildfires. Of course, every time that you have anything like an oil pipeline or a well out on the ocean, you could have all kinds of issues, like the example of the Deepwater Horizon explosion. The interesting thing about that is that the Caribbean coastline has actually recovered pretty well despite all the devastation. So it's interesting that Mother Nature is a little bit stronger than humans, I think. Energy and mineral resources are very large in the United States. We are becoming truly energy independent, which will be a very, very good thing for us in the future. You'll notice that most of the people that came into Canada and the United States migrated. So the idea that Native Americans were always here in this realm is not true. They migrated just like everybody else via the land bridge which connected Siberia across Alaska. You'll notice from this map the United States and Canada heavily uses irrigation. Those are pivots and it gives you an idea of the importance of water in the Great Plains and the land use, private land use and ownership and so on and so forth. So it's a well-managed operation, and as a result it's done very well. Where there's a big movement toward organic farming and trying to get rid of the chemicals in plants, and so we've seen a lot of that going on in the United States and Canada. Obviously, there are some environmental challenges in this realm due to acid rain and high energy consumption, but I think the trade-off is that the energy produces a lot more consistent safety in our country and provides the energy necessary to power it, and that the pollution actually has been decreasing in the United States and Canada for several years now. We're probably producing less pollution now than we ever have. We are well balanced in terms of mineral and energy resources, as you can tell on this map. Unfortunately, we have a drug problem in the United States and Canada. Marijuana is the most illicit substance, and you'll find problems with its use in California and British Columbia, believe it or not, due to legalization. In terms of history, we have a large story of indigenous histories with a lot of different cultural groups, over 2,000 different languages. Native Americans have occupied the two countries for many, many years, and then the Europeans came and migrated into the country, and then through interaction between natives and Europeans created the two countries that we have today. Colonization was both, again, a good thing and a bad thing. It brought in Europe's resources, industries, knowledge, Western civ values. Unfortunately, there was exploitation of the native people and eventually Revolutionary War between Great Britain and the United States. The legacy of slavery, well, everyone knows about that. The United States participated in the slave trade and the slave industry for many years, and then with the rest of Western civilization eliminated slavery through the American Civil War. So even though slavery existed before the United States and Canada existed, the elimination of slavery was something that the United States and Canada had a hand in doing. So if you look further at the history of the United States and Canada, you'll see it really started with the development from the east moving west. The impact of the American Civil War obviously helped promote industrialization and then migration into the west coast, moving toward the center of the country. You'll notice a similarity between the two economies, between the United States and Canada in terms of trade. You'll also notice a number of things in regard to transforming economies from the industrial belt moving to the Sun Belt and what we call creative destruction. That is, the destruction of old jobs and the creation of new, creating a new economy very heavily information technology loaded. And Canada is very much a part of that. Wealth and inequality, well, in any capitalist country you're going to have inequality. Actually, there's less inequality probably in the United States and Canada than you'll find worldwide. The population rate, the poverty rate in the United States is about 15%. We do have high levels of child poverty in both countries. And the wealth gap, well, the wealth gap is probably more a direct result of capitalism not working properly due to governmental intervention. And that's a political debate which we are having today. We've had some global economic crises with bank failures, personal debt, mortgage crisis, and deflation and inflation. The big debate is what's causing that and how to eliminate it. The big argument is more free enterprise or less. That is a political decision. Another area of interest to the United States is the Caribbean area. The United States has been very interested in that for years. We fought a war over control of that area, the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. Obviously, the Panama Canal was a very important part of our development. Panama Canal is now owned by Panama. And of course, China is now making inroads to the same area. The United States has a very unique federal system. It is a federal republic, not a democracy as most people would like to call it. And we are debating right now the role of the federal government in everyday life. Canada's focus has been primarily on social welfare, and due to its low population has been fairly successful at it. If it becomes too large, then social welfare programs become problematic. Here is a chart showing you the political and military influence in this part of the world, and you can see the battle deaths as a direct result of American war interventions. Notice the percentage of deaths in the American Civil War, how it compares to the rest of the wars. One of the problems of being the largest free nation is the fact that we are involved in protecting much of the world, and the big debate is the U.S. war on terror. With the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the elimination of Saddam Hussein, the terrorism that has existed with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the relationship that we have with Pakistan and trying to control them from leading more terrorism and being more promoting of democracy, and then of course the high cost of war, something that's very, very hard on all Americans, not only in financial but in giving lives to the effort. United States, like Canada, is very involved in social movements. We have, of course, the famous women's movement in 1848, the environmental movement led by Henry David Thoreau and George Marsh, and of course we have the energy debate that's going on, whether we want the Keystone Pipeline clean energy, or we want green energy, which would produce higher prices and less availability. In terms of religion and language, the United States is predominantly English, with Roman Catholics and Protestants sharing the main religious areas. Canada is primarily French and English, and they have a high degree of multiculturalism. Culture works the same way. We are very heavily involved in the arts, music, and sports, as you can tell. The big question is the United States really pushing their culture on other parts of the world? And that is something we've already talked about, that some people believe that the spread of American culture is threatening to the rest of the world. In terms of demography, the United States the white population makes up about 3/4 of the total population. Minorities have a tendency to have a higher fertility rate and also a higher poverty rate. Canada, a little bit different, both coming from a British-French background, a lot more immigrant populations, so it's kind of difficult to compare the two countries. This kind of shows you the immigration patterns into the United States from Europe, and you'll notice the different color codes of doing that. Also the migration patterns here in the United States, moving from rural to urban, westward expansion, African Americans moving out of the South into the North, and then of course people moving from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. We're seeing a lot of industrialization and urbanization in the United States and in Canada. The cities are becoming more and more diverse. European settlements are changing, and there's kind of a pull of manufacturing jobs. And the United States is moving into more suburban life. The future geography question has to do with the United States dominance, and you can think that the United States is not as dominant as it used to be. China is a big threat to our situation. However, China relies on us for aid and support. A big concern, obviously, is security, terror, and war, and your text talks about that. And then the big questions on environmental change. The biggest issue on environmental change is how active the American government ought to be to try to manipulate climate, which is very debatable as to whether that can even happen. And then, of course, the big debate on whether global warming is an accurate theory or it's just a claim made by a few scientists that are trying to scare everyone. I'm of the mind that we don't know a lot about climate and that we need to study it, and so there is no, at least in my mind, there is no consensus on it. It ought to be studied and evaluated, and we ought to try to do the best we can to not pollute and to promote energy sources that are helpful for the development of the country. But that's my personal opinion. You may have other ideas.